Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Leah from the Tiny Bookstore, and thank you for joining me for this afternoon's very special Tiny Bookstore Live. We usually air on Saturdays at 3 p.m., but we're doing a special session because last Saturday's edition had to be postponed a little bit. So today what we're going to be talking about is it's a topic that isn't necessarily the most comfortable of things to talk about, but I really felt motivated to just at least put my thoughts out there. I'm not so arrogant as to think that I'm going to change the discourse around race and racism in the United States. But the way that I see it is that if I can get one person to just kind of think about things a little bit differently and to just kind of put fresher and calmer thoughts into the discourse, then it's going to be worth my time. So let's get started. So as far as, why racism is something that matters, I know that race is considered to be a social construct. It's not necessarily real, but the fact that people treat others differently because of race is something that it's very real. And I think that in the United States, one of the things that makes our country great is the fact that our motto, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. So basically what that means is that together we're stronger than we are when we're separate. And something that, racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, it's something that it separates us, it divides us, and it keeps us from accomplishing what we can as a society because we're basically fighting each other instead of seeing each other as being equals. So again, I think that it's something that we should all do what we can to just learn more about each other. And that's where what we're seeing nowadays with these book bans and people trying to suppress certain types of books, it's very troubling. From a free speech point of view, you never really want to see that. We want to see open ideas. We want to be able to debate those ideas. We want to be able to basically see things on merit, right? So if we're limiting access to things that help us understand more, that's always going to be something that's going to be deeply troubling. But I think that where that makes things a little bit worse, especially in this moment, is that, again, right now we are divided and people are monetizing hate and division. And that's keeping our country from moving forward. It's keeping us from basically realizing our potential. I know that a lot of people don't necessarily think that the United States is the greatest country in the world. If it's not the greatest, it certainly is one of the top ones. And again, what we're not seeing that we saw in the past is a certain form of agreed unity and just kind of having pride in us being together and moving forward. Now, I'm not saying that the United States is perfect. Of course, we've had our flaws, as far as slavery, what was done as far as Asian immigrants, basically since the beginning, the xenophobia, that's not wonderful. But we can say that as a people, we have grown. And the way that that's happened is by open access to other people's ideas. So when we're seeing people banning books because it's making people uncomfortable, that just doesn't wash. The only way that we're going to be able to learn is by seeing these other perspectives. And one thing that I tend to notice just in life in general is that when you start to feel uncomfortable, that's usually a sign that you're about to learn something. So if we're going through and keeping people from things that are making them feel uncomfortable, that's not really going to help progress. It's not going to help growth. Now, it's one thing if we're dealing with uncomfortable falsehoods, that's something that should be limited. But if we're talking about uncomfortable truths, then that's how we grow. That's how we learn about one another. And one of the things that we're seeing as far as books that are being challenged, some of them are fiction books. And some people don't put as much weight behind fiction as they do behind nonfiction books and, just the classics. But one thing that's important to realize is that fiction helps open our eyes to other stories. Even though they may be imagined, they're still, writers work from life experience. They work from things that they know. So if we're not seeing these stories where authors are talking about what their lived experiences are, that means that our kids and, hey, even adults out there that aren't being exposed to these different types of fiction, they're not seeing those stories. And it's really difficult to hate or be afraid of something that you understand, if you really truly do understand it. And that's where limiting access to these stories that explain what life experiences are, that's just keeping us one step further away from accepting each other, understanding each other, and growing. Now, again, with what we're seeing nowadays with the entire debate about critical race theory and, the history of the United States, we know that there are terrible things that have happened throughout the world. And one of the ways that we learn history for a reason. Yes, it's in school, like we're learning it for some type of purpose. They're not setting us in history classes just for no reason. Basically from a societal point of view, we want to make sure that people are learning from history. I know that the saying is that those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And if we're not learning about hatred and poor choices and just poor leadership in the past, we're going to be at a high risk of doing those things in the future. What I find kind of funny is that while people talk about how, slavery, that was all in the past, the Holocaust, that was in the past, we need to move forward, people don't have the same challenge to the idea of the fact that in science, we learn about how we used to think that the earth was flat. We learn about how bloodletting was considered to be an acceptable form of medical treatment. But we learn these things in science because it shows us how far we've gone, and it encourages us to push science forward. History works the exact same way. The way that we know to move forward and push forward and do things differently is by looking at where we were and see where we've been and see what can we do to push society forward a little bit further. Now, all of this is coming to a head at a very interesting time. There's a professor out at the University of Pennsylvania. Her name is Amy Wax, a very controversial type of professor. And what she's been trading in along with, insights into the law has been a type of nationalism, xenophobia, racism. A few years ago, she said that in her experience, Black students weren't graduating at the top or even the top 50% of the University of Pennsylvania Law School. A few weeks ago, she said that there fewer Asians should be brought into the United States. And why I think that that's kind of interesting that all of this is happening right now is that if we're looking for true equality, and I know that a lot of people talk about how we need to get to color blindness, that we shouldn't see race, that the way that we stop seeing race is by stop seeing race and not talking about it. And that's a great idea. That's a wonderful idea. I can't wait until we are in a world where people are truly colorblind. The problem is that until people are actually acting in a colorblind way, we need to be able to see how people are being treated differently. So if we're going to sit here and say that, everyone is created equal, but we have a law professor talking about how people from certain countries shouldn't come in because of just this broad brush, the stereotype about whether they can conform to American standards and to American culture. I'm sorry, that shows ignorance. That shows that person is not being exposed to other people and other cultures. So that's where, book bans, failure to study history, failure to learn about other cultures is really leading us down a very dark and ignorant path. And that we're talking about someone at one of the top universities in the United States. And for her to have such a platform, there are people who are going to believe that she's right. So the only way that we can challenge that is by countering that with actual knowledge, with actual experience, and with true history. Now, one thing that's just kind of tangentially related that I want to kind of make clear, I've been getting some feedback from people who think that since this is a Black-owned bookstore, that I might be a place where people may feel comfortable with anti-Semitism. And I just want to make it just crystal clear. That's not what I'm about. That's not what the Tiny Bookstore is about. I believe that Jewish people are equal to everyone else. And I know some people are saying that, that's an issue of religion and not race. But again, race, social construct, if we're treating people differently and as an ethnic group because of something, we're just going to go ahead and call that racism. And that's something that's not accepted here. So just so that you all know, this isn't a place where anti-Semitism is going to thrive, at least not in my bookstore. Okay, so at the end of the day, you might be wondering, what can you do to just learn more and move forward? And honestly, what I can tell you is just pick up a book. They're out there. They're there for us to learn. New Kid by Jerry Craft. If you're looking to learn about the experience of someone who is Black going into a majority white culture, that's a very good place to start to just kind of get an understanding of that perspective. Because again, right now we're not in a colorblind world. When I was reading New Kid, it really spoke to me because I know that experience of people calling you an Oreo, saying that, hey, you're Black on the outside, white on the inside. Like that, what does that even mean? And the fact that that does mean something, that says something. And a lot of people, they don't know what that's like. So reading something like New Kid, again, the fact that you see some school districts and some parents trying to ban that, that is so unnerving, because what they're saying is that the experience that I had and that I lived, they don't want their kids to hear about that. And why I would want your kids to hear about that is so that your kids don't say that to my kid when they're in school. So I think that really shows a good example of how trying to ban a book in limited experiences can actually keep your kid from doing a little bit better. Now, another book that I would like to recommend that some people may have read in high school, but in this day and age, pick it back up again. That's Night by Elie Wiesel. It really does give us an informed perspective of what it was like in the Holocaust. Right now, we have people who are minimizing it. We're seeing an uptick in anti-Semitic violence. And I think that if we go back and see the history of how we got to the Holocaust, we can see where there are disturbing trends that we're heading back down that road right now. So as far as, so last week was Martin Luther King Day, and there was a lot of talk about, what he said and what he stood for. And the funny thing about it is that Martin Luther King Jr. was a very prolific writer. He wrote many speeches, many essays, many books. And what I would encourage people to do to just kind of understand how we've grown in a lot of ways since the 1960s, but not quite far enough, is to go back and read what Dr. King wrote. Because when you see that the same things that he was saying that we should be doing back in 1967 have still not been accomplished, I think that there's room for us to grow and learn there. One of the other topics of debate has been the question of whether the bigger issue in the United States is race or class. I think that that's something that you can't really pull apart. They're interrelated. The race being a social construct means that we're using it to sort people into groups. And that's just another way of saying it's class. People are using racial groupings to sort people into various classes. And when you consider the fact that a disproportionate number of Black people do happen to be indigent and, not necessarily wealthy, that shows how, economic class also feeds into racial class, and there's a whole, what's the technical term, history into why it is exactly that we're seeing that Black people are reflected in the lower rungs of of economic class. So again, pick up a book. A good place to start is 400 Souls, which was edited by Ibram Kendi. And yes, I know you may not agree with his perspectives as far as anti-racism. He is trained in history. He is going towards source materials. Just because you may disagree with his point of view doesn't mean that you can't learn from him. And just to kind of interrupt myself here, one of the things that I tend to do is that I will recommend books that I agree with their perspectives, but I'm also going to recommend books that I don't necessarily agree with perspectives. It's important that in order to understand other people, we need to understand how they think. And a perfect example of a book that I did not necessarily agree with their conclusions or how it was executed was Social Injustice by Helen Pluckrose and her co-authors. And that particular book just kind of it was bashing certain ideas of as far as, social justice and other different types of, just race and cultural studies. They call it grievance studies. So again, I don't necessarily agree with the approach that they took in that book, but I felt that it's important for other people to read. So that way you understand that particular line of logic and to see a bad example of an explanation of conservative or classic liberal viewpoints. If you're looking to a coherent view of, conservative and classical liberal perspectives, pick up a book by Randall Kennedy, pick up John McWhorter, pick up Andrew Sullivan. But as far as social injustice, read it to understand that this is a weak argument, but then read the others to see what the strong arguments actually happen to be. So now that I'm done with that little tangent, getting back into doing some historical reading. I know that some people may disagree with A People's History of the United States. It does offer a solid alternate view of what history is. And one thing about history is that a lot of people think that what you're seeing in the book is definitely what happened. But what's actually true is that everything comes down to who it was that recorded it. So if you're only limiting yourself to one particular view and a Eurocentric view at that of history, then you're not getting the full picture and you're not necessarily getting the complete truth. We are, as a people, have difficulty agreeing with things that we're seeing on videotape. So, take that, skeptical view to what you're doing when you're reading historical works as well. If we can't agree with what we're seeing on video, then we have to understand that people who are contributing towards history aren't necessarily going to see things in the exact same way. So, just to kind of wrap this up, because I didn't want to go too long and, disturb y'all's lunches. As far as the books from Martin Luther King Jr. to pick up and read, and again, this is just a place to start. He's not just a quote factory. He observed what was going on. He was offering ideas for the future and explanations for the past. And pick up a copy of Why We Can't Wait, again, by Martin Luther King Jr. A lot of these essays are available online for the bargain price of free. So, hey, pull it that way. But if you want to go the convenient route, borrow Why We Can't Wait from the library. It's there right now, Allegheny County Library System. Several copies available if you just go in and grab it. Or you can put a hold and reserve it online as well. Yay, internet. As far as Martin Luther King Jr.'s ideas of where we can go to move forward, what you're going to look for is Where Do We Go From Here? Again, Where Do We Go From Here by Martin Luther King Jr. Again, available at your local library today. And I would encourage everyone to pick them up and read them. That's how we learn. That's how we quote him properly. And that's how we start moving forward. Because a lot of people ask, how exactly do we go from this place where there's so much racial discord and strife and there's so much to divide us when we should be working together? This is a good start. But again, it's just a start. But that's pretty much all I have to say about that particular topic. I'm going to do a reading group on Where Do We Go From Here for the month of February. So if you'd like to do that and read it along with me, pick it up from your local library. If you want to know other options for getting it, just go ahead, drop a comment or send us an email and we'll do what we can to hook you up with it. But again, support your local library. It's a great book to own, but hey, if you don't want to go that far, it's just, again, get it from the library. And with that, I will see you all this Saturday, 3 o'clock, for our next Tiny Bookstore Live. Have a great Tuesday.